Welcome to Unexpected Journey, the show where each week top professionals share work wisdom and life lessons about their careers and what they have learned about human experience in the workplace. I'm your host, Bibb. Here is Unexpected Journey. Welcome to the Unexpected Journey podcast. And today we have with us Jennie Blumenthal. After spending 20 years in corporate America, helping Fortune 500 companies manage multi-million-dollar growth strategies, Jennie left her partnership in a global consulting firm to launch her own leadership company. In addition to her role as CEO, she also serves as a professional speaker, an adjunct professor in strategy, a board member, and this is how I met her. She is the author of Corporate Rehab, Ditch the Hustle Culture and Thrive Again. Thank you so much for joining us, Jennie. We're so glad to have you.
Oh, thanks for having me, Ann. I'm excited about this. Thanks.
You know what? Your book is just absolutely amazing. It is. I met you before, right as you were about to launch the book, and then to see the results of the book has just been amazing.
Thank you. I so appreciate that.
So I was drawn to your book immediately. So we're both a member of Chief. And we were in a speaking group and we were talking how you were going to present it. And one of the things that I was absolutely drawn to was one of the things that your book says is corporate rehab is about how leaders can become addicted to the hustle culture. And I felt like when I read that one statement, I was like I was immediately smacked between the eyes, because for the last 25, 30 years or so, hi, my name is Ann. I'm an addict. I'm addicted to the whole hustle culture. I have been. I feel like I've gone to rehab over the last couple of years, but it resonated. And so what made you decide to write this book? It's crazy.
Yes. So thank you for saying that, first off, because it has been really exciting. And I was thrilled that when we met, we were still getting it out into the world. And then it became an Amazon bestseller and all those fun things, which was
so great to watch.
Thank you. Yeah. What made me actually write it was trying to process and make meaning from my own pain that I had just gone through. I was addicted to the hustle culture too, although I didn't know it at the time. I had been, as you said, leading this huge multi-million-dollar business unit and managing all these people, and thought I was really killing it. I was achieving and performing and doing all the things that I thought meant that I would be successful. And meanwhile, had a husband and 2 kids and was trying to really make sure that I was around for them enough and really being an involved mom and singing lullabies and all of those things. But it really wasn't until the pandemic that I realized how much I was trying to be happy. I was trying to think that this is what I wanted, and how much day in and day out, we didn't have the words for it at the time outside of a doctor's office, that I was really in extreme burnout and I had no idea. I just thought this is what was needed at this level, and you just keep going and you just hustle harder. And so what made me write the book is that as I started to talk about my experience, I had so many women reaching out, and men too, saying, oh my gosh, this is me. And you have to hear my story and tell me what you did to go from this burnout and survival mode into thriving. And so that's why I wrote the book.
I think that is actually a really interesting thing to point out from the forefront, is that when you wrote the book, it was from the point of view that so many women were suffering from burnout in the executive capacity, in the corporate structure, and it wasn't really being addressed. However, since your book has come out, this is something that is more than just a problem that women are suffering.
Right.
It is a systemic issue in corporate culture.
Yes. Yes. It is. Absolutely. And I think it's interesting you mentioned that, because I wrote the book thinking at first, well, I should just make this for all genders. And the book is really, regardless of how you identify, regardless of what your conditioning might have been from a gender or even from a race perspective, it includes a number of different stories, and the process itself works for everyone. The stories that I anchored on were stories of women executives that were in the same life that I was, because I felt that would be more authentic. It'd be very hard for me to represent the limiting beliefs or the background of a white man in America, because I'm not a white man in America. And so I didn't want to try to represent the experience that I had not lived. Most of the experiences were lived experiences and on some level I could relate to. But the reality is, it is systemic throughout America. The process itself works no matter who you are, because it's really about how to actually recognize some of these things that are happening, evaluate them, heal them, arise from it, and then build a new life and work that is more meaningful to you, or that doesn't drag you into burnout. But I think you're right. It's interesting to see how much the pandemic shone a big bright light on the systemic issues of burnout that often we think are just the way it has to be, and it really doesn't.
I'm like stuck on this burnout thing, because many of us have suffered from this. In fact, while you were interviewing people for the book, because you interviewed, 300 individuals?
Yes. Yeah.
How many of those people actually suffered from burnout?
The predominant amount of them did. Their stories were all over the place, and I can tell you a few of those. I'm going to start by, though, just diagnosing or defining what burnout really is. And I think this is, to your point, on the systemic side. When I started to dig into the research for the book and trying to figure out what's this root cause that keeps us in this survival mode, and we got to hustle culture, but burnout is one of the outputs from being caught in the hustle culture. And so when I looked into burnout, I realized that the World Health Organization actually changed the definition of burnout in 2019. So before the pandemic, they recognized that there was an addition to the definition that needed to be added for chronic unmanaged workplace stress. So to me, that means you've got the leading health organizations saying, wait a minute, there's something going on that's reaching epidemic proportion. And when you think about those different pieces, it's chronic and unmanaged. So it's something that's constant in your life, and you're not finding a way to discharge some of that stress. It's happening in the workplace, and it is really stress related. And I think that's so important. And we go into this in the book, and I talk about this in my coaching and speaking too, to really arm and empower women and men to understand their biology so that they can actually hack some of the responses when they are in this extreme stress. So there's ways that you can actually retrain your brain. You can recognize in your body physiology what's happening when you're in burnout and shift that, so that you can shift into thriving. But know that you're not alone, because if the World Health Organization and the stats are off the chart, 78% of people at some point in their career have been in burnout. Right now, 50% of all executive women are experiencing burnout. So this is something that, to your point, is systemic.
Those are
huge numbers. This is not just, if you individually find the right app, you'll discover the 25th hour in the day and you'll become much more productive. There's certain things you can do as an individual, but just know that you're in a scenario where these issues are really systemic. So I think that's the first piece of understanding that. And then to add just the anecdotes of what people said, it was things like, sometimes even in the interview, they didn't realize that they were having a stress response.
I was about to say, did they even know that they were suffering from burnout?
No, it was interesting. I would say, if you ever experienced burnout, I work really hard. There was this one time, though, that I've never really figured this out. I started losing my hair, or I was rushed to the emergency room, or I threw up for 18 months, but only Monday through Friday. I think that was probably related to workplace stress. But it's these things that we just absorb. And I think women tend to just put their heads down and keep going. There's mouths to feed, or babies to take care of, or that project to get done, or the deal to close. And often we don't realize that we hold so much of the stress within ourselves without having a way to manage it and make sure that it's not just wreaking havoc on your body and your mind.
It's really curious to me. A couple of things. It's one, how many people don't realize that they are suffering?
Yeah.
But two, how is it impacting their job?
So true. It's so true. I think there's a big piece of it that, first of all, it's impacting them, to your point, that Tim Ferriss has a great quote for, he was working with an executive, and the executive said, I just don't want to deal with that, but had a bunch of problems in his personal life. And Tim was saying, you might not be dealing with it, but it's dealing with you. It's showing up somehow. And these stress symptoms leak out into other parts of our lives if we don't collectively deal with that. So the first piece is you're handling it somehow, right? It might be a healthy way that you're handling it, it might be unhealthy. But how it shows up then at work, if you're burned out, either you're not able to give what you once gave, that the three symptoms of it that show up the most are exhaustion, where you're just depleted, cynicism, which sometimes is hard to tell if you've got a sarcastic humor like mine, but it's overly cynicism. And then the third one is inefficacy, where you feel like no matter what you do, nothing will ever change. And so when you've got an employee or you yourself are in that burnout, you're not going to be able to lead the team in an effective way. The things that suffer are things like innovation or doing something differently, because we get caught up in this stress response that really actually triggers this whole fight flight response we've all heard of. And we go right back to reacting in situations instead of being able to intentionally lead from a place that isn't so reactive. And the thing that I thought was really interesting as I started to dig into it, we've all heard of fight or flight, right? If for anybody who needs a refresher, this coined this term for this old part of our brain that gets hijacked. It's the amygdala, where something gets triggered and it gets caught there and very reactive, as opposed to the front part of your brain, the PFC, which actually does the cognitive thinking. And you're either ready to fight back at the person or you flight and get out of the scenario.
I thought that was just a migraine.
Yeah, could be, or it could be a hijack. We'll see. But usually what happens is in the old times, that was like if you were running from a bear, you would either fight the bear, which might not have worked out in your favor, or run away from it, right? Present day, your body is still coded with some of those responses from all kinds of experiences you picked up through your life. And so you tend to either react by fighting or react by removing yourself from the situation. But there's two more responses that women in particular have, and those are the freeze or the fawn response. So in some cases, you might have found that it is easier to freeze. And you can actually see this with, if you watch nature shows, you can see this with a deer will freeze and you're like, oh my God, run. And it's just frozen in time or frozen in space because it's having a freeze response to the predator. What that shows up when you're an executive is I have a lot of women that I coach that'll say, I don't know, there's just when this certain type of boss presents that's yelling at me, I just stop and my mind goes blank and I can't really get it to go back online again. They're having a freeze response in that moment. Or sometimes a fawn response, which I don't know that you see as much in nature, but in animals. But with executive women, you do when you're dealing with a ton of egos. Sometimes it's easier to placate that really nasty client or stroke the ego of a boss who's being really intense until you can get them back to a place where they're having a natural conversation. So that fawn and freeze, in addition to the flight and fright, it might be something that you're having. And to your point of how that shows up at work, you're optimally leading if you're leading from that reactive place, as opposed to being able to be intentional about dealing with another human who's really at the same level having their own response in that moment, as opposed to dealing from this reaction.
I hear the term be intentional on a lot of these shows, that if you're not leading intentionally, if you're not serving intentionally, if you are not, essentially everything that you do, whether it's at work or in life, should do with intention and with purpose, especially if you are doing it remotely or not in person. And the pandemic really showed us that. And the amount of burnout that we saw increase during the pandemic. And I'm curious, do you think that burnout truly increased during the pandemic, or that we simply became aware of the amount of burnout?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a very individual response depending on what the scenarios are that you yourself are going through. But I do think that there was a chance to make the invisible visible. So when daycares were shut down and parents were trying to do Zooms with kids on their lap or learning, like my 3rd and 5th grader were learning math at the kitchen table alone while I was trying to do Zooms. It just didn't work. So when I think about that piece, I think some of that was just realizing, oh my gosh, the support structure that I had in place to do my job is no longer here. and I have to step in. And so there's a real caregiving amount there. But I think there's three things that I found that really became more of a challenge, especially for women. That first piece is that women have more caregiving responsibilities in general. What they found is in a heterosexual couple, if both parents work, the woman was putting in 20 hours additional caregiving time on top of what the man in the relationship was and on top of her job. So to that point, I think there's real burnout that was happening. And when you actually take away the support structures in a pandemic, that just really shone a light. At least in my family, all four of us were in the same house and nobody could leave to go to work or get on a plane. And you really saw a division of labor.
And it tested us, didn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think that was one big piece that really was showing that. The second piece is like limiting beliefs of the things that we do to ourselves that say, I need to work even harder. I need to prove myself. And sometimes we can add to that burnout because it's ways that we hold ourselves back and we contribute to that. And that happens, I think, regardless of whether you're in a pandemic or not. What the pandemic did for a lot of us was just made the rest of the world quiet for a minute so that those beliefs spoke louder, which was my experience for sure. And then the third piece is the structural ways that you do actually have to prove yourself more sometimes, depending on how you show up in the world or depending on what type of workplace that you're in. And so I think the pandemic did show a little bit of that as well, because when you're all on Zooms, how much it was a little bit of a great equalizer of showing like, hey, I'm trying to do this job and I have all these other responsibilities, or I'm putting in 120% and Tim's only putting in 80%, but somehow we're supposed to be compensated for the same job. So I think there was that piece too, that the pandemic really helped. I think a lot of women see other people moving, say, hey, I'm not in this echo chamber of I'm only valuable in this one job. So I think there was a little bit of an information transparency piece there too.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody the other day. I cannot remember. They gave me a quote. I can't remember who the quote is from. So y'all don't come after me. I just don't remember. But if you know who it is, by all means, put it in the comments. The quote is something along the lines of remote work, hybrid work doesn't create bad management, bad leadership. It simply highlights or brings it to the forefront.
Yes.
And I thought my head nearly exploded. Like, wow, that is so true. And there were so many situations during the pandemic where, poor leadership or lack of leadership, the need for leadership training,
Yes.
These things were all truly highlighted during the pandemic. So taking a step back, I'm going to encourage everyone to get your book. There's going to be a link down below for everybody, but I want everybody to have a chance to get to know you a little bit better outside of the book. So we're going to play a little this or that to get a little insight into Jennie. Okay. So are you familiar with the game?
Yes, I am.
Perfect. So I'm just going to jump right into it. Jennie, what would you prefer? Big city or countryside?
Oh, gosh, that's a hard one. I live in a big city, but I definitely would prefer the countryside.
Why?
I grew up in the country, and I think at this phase in my life, I'm done with the being on 3 planes a week like I once was. And I would prefer to have a little bit more space and frankly, to see the sunset and the sunrise. Those are the 2 biggest highlights of my day. And I'm always happiest when I can see them right outside of a kitchen window.
My husband and I went and looked at a house one time in the country. And when we stepped out of the car, it was almost like our blood pressure dropped 10 points.
Yes. It's so true.
So I think I would probably have to go with you on the country.
There you go. We can get a house big enough for all of us.
If beach was not an option, that's a different story altogether.
Yeah. I hear you.
What about pep talk or motivational quote?
Ooh, I think the motivational quote, because I think we can take our own meaning from it, as opposed to sometimes a pep talk. It depends on who's giving it and who's receiving, but sometimes it can be discharging advice that isn't exactly what the person needs to get, versus I think the motivational quote gives you a chance to go inside and internal a little bit, which is, I think, where the real growth happens. And
you can take it with you. Use it for multiple needs.
Yes.
I like that. All right. This is a big one in our house. Are you ready?
I don't know. I think so.
Laundry or dishes?
Oh, yes. Okay. Laundry, 100%. And I am I must be like the 1% of people that actually must wash, fold, and put away laundry on the same day, because apparently that's like a really hard thing for a lot of people. It is like the biggest pet peeve of mine not to do that, because why do the laundry if it's just going to get wrinkled? Then you have to do it over again. I don't iron. I would take that all day long versus the dishes.
Okay. First of all, I agree with you on it needs to get all done what's the point of doing it?
Get it. I really
if
don't.
I don't do laundry. Like I would pick the dishes all day long.
That's funny. And that said, my dryer is full of wrinkled clothes at the moment, but there's a wrinkle setting that'll take care of that.
There you go.
There's ways around it.
Absolutely. That's great. So going back to what we were talking about how we got in burnout and how we get stuck there. Why do we get stuck if it's hurting us so much? And it's hurting our customers. We were just talking about the fact that if you get stuck in a burnout, we're not bringing our full self, we're not doing a good job. Then in that kind of a domino effect, we're doing a poor job. We're not bringing our full self. We're hurting our customers. Then a review comes. It's just this circular effect that eventually we are not going to get to keep our job. Why can't we pull ourselves out? What is happening? Why are we staying here?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's ways we hold ourselves and get stuck. And then there's ways that companies unwittingly, or sometimes wittingly, but most of it's unwittingly, I think, keep us stuck. So the internal side is things like mindsets and behaviors, where it's either patterns of people pleasing or patterns of trying to do too much because we feel like we're not enough to begin with, or if we perform, that's the only way we'll get that validation. So there's ways that we keep ourselves stuck in the hustle culture and burnout. But I think there's also very real ways that companies do it. And to your point on the employee experience, traditionally the employee experience has been seen as a cost center, and it is something that is going to take off from the bottom line, and we have to do it to stay competitive and be an employer of choice, but it's really just taking away from profit. Whereas the customer experience is something that we've now more recently understood that investment in that customer experience is going to drive that top line. But what so many people don't understand is they're just mirrors of each other, right? And so you can't treat, if how you treat your employees and the experience they deliver is what's going to be the customer experience, you can't treat one expense as a cost center and one as a revenue generator and expect to have the same outcome. So I think there's ways that I would love to see us as companies make some changes in that in 2023 and moving forward, because we've started from a customer side, but unless we bring the employee experience with it, we're just going to wind up saying, we gave people an extra day off, or we gave them a mental health day, 1 out of the 365 days. Why aren't they working 80 hours a week and delivering this great customer experience? There's still this very nickel and dime approach to the employee experience that I've seen versus what we're investing on the customer side from a digital perspective that I'd like to see change.
Absolutely. I think that there's a bit in there. We've heard a lot about psychological safety in the workplace recently, and individuals feeling safe enough to actually talk about that they're burnout, what their needs are, what their limits are. This is my job. This is what I'm hired to do. This is what I'm going to do, or I'm going to work these hours. So the safety to say that and set boundaries is a big thing that is being discussed in corporate culture right now.
Yes, I agree. And I think if you don't have psychological safety, and Amy Edmondson does great work on this, the challenge is when you say the word psychological safety and people say, of course we've got, gosh, that sounds so scary. But really what you're saying, is it safe to tell the truth? Is it safe to speak up? And if you don't have that, I think the fundamental thing to building a healthy culture is trust. And if you don't have the safety to speak up without penalties or to be able to say, this is my experience, then how can you have trust? How can you have a place where people can build anything after building on this really shaky foundation?
Which is interesting because we are asking our employees to build trust with their customers, their clients.
Yep.
And in order to do that, shouldn't we build that same relationship with them?
That's right. Yeah, I agree.
What?
I agree. And it's interesting. There's little ways that it gets eroded. And some of them, I can understand how we got there, right? I worked in a lot of regulated industries, and there's a whole element of compliance that has to happen for different reporting standards, which I understand. But know that if you're in a regulated industry and you're driving compliance, your people feel like you don't trust them already. So how are you actually going to instill more of that trust? In other cultures, I saw people would speak up and say, hey, this is really negatively impacting our team. And they would be told, you just need to get on strategy. You just don't understand the strategy. And it was a bit of an emperor's new clothes scenario where no, they understand the strategy. They just don't think it's the right one. And they're being told, if you disagree, then you're not a leader. As opposed to, if you disagree, then create an environment where if there's enough disagreement, let's diagnose what's actually going on. Either it's not being communicated well, or there's a problem with the actual strategy, but you're not creating enough buy-in if you're shutting people down when they speak up. And I consulted with a ton of Fortune 500 companies. I can tell you, I saw this in almost every culture I was in, with a few exceptions. And all different dimensions would emphasize certain parts of it. But that trust, I think, comes back to if you're asking people to give 120%, but then you're actually treating them like you don't trust them, how can you possibly expect to get the best employees delivering on a consistent basis? And you saw during the Great Resignation, a lot of people leaving for that reason alone.
Yeah. So what are the signals for a leader to know what's happening with their team, or even themselves as an individual? We talked about earlier the fact that people didn't even realize they were suffering from burnout. As an individual, it's one thing, but as a leader, it's something completely different to recognize what's happening with your employees. What am I looking for?
Yeah. So you can definitely look for the individual spots of the exhaustion, the cynicism, and the inefficacy, I think, as an individual contributor, or if that's coming up a lot on the team. The other piece is really what I like to dig into is some of the root causes and understand those are the symptoms, but are the causes things like boundaries being violated, that we're constantly trespassing on people's time or energy boundaries. We're asking them to give too much. We're expecting emails to be returned at 10. We're expecting calls on the weekend. All real examples of things I saw in a number of different cultures or women that I coach on a regular basis. And that's just the way of doing business, as opposed to a boundary that's being trampled on. The other piece is where people start to feel the root cause being purpose and lack of fulfillment. They start to feel like, I'm not really feeling like I'm doing anything that matters. And that's where you start to see people pulling back, quiet quitting. If you see people doing some quiet quitting, there's a lot of reasons why people go there. But if that's happening in your organization, it's not a signal to punish your people. It's a signal to dig into asking why. I think it's been really interesting to watch the responses. And I'll acknowledge that there's definitely bad actors in every part of society. But for the most part, if this is the first time your people have been pulling back, I don't think that label of they're just lazy people really works. Were they working their butts off and now suddenly they're lazy? I don't think that's really the case. I think what they're signaling to you is, I've tolerated a lot and now something needs to change. And your job as a leader is to understand what needs to change and what's actually happening. So I think looking for those signals and really just starting by being curious with your team to understand what's really going on and dig beneath the surface is the key to finding out what's happening.
So for that individual person that is listening right now, they've not said anything to anyone. They know that they should probably join the same group that I'm in. Say, hi, I'm Ann. I'm addicted to hustle culture. They know they have that addiction. They're exhausted. They just can't keep going this way, and they know it, but they're scared to say anything because of the impact that it could have on their life. That's a scary thing. It's a scary place to be at. What would you tell them based on the things that you have learned, not only from writing your book and talking to hundreds of people, but from your own personal journey? I'm going to give you the floor right now. Just talk directly to that person.
Yeah, the first thing I would say to them is be gentle with yourself. Chances are you've driven yourself really hard. If you're hooked on the hustle culture, you're finding yourself swimming in it. You don't even notice it. It's the air you're breathing. And so the first step is to just really be gentle and not just pile shame on top of that of why do I always do this and why can't I figure it out? And everybody else has a Facebook version of their career and feels like it's perfect for them. You're not alone. This is an epidemic that's happening across America. And so the first part is just being gentle. And then the second thing I would say is let's start to get curious. Like, try to just examine some of that curiosity of what you might be doing from a mindset and behavior perspective to keep that in place, and get curious about the environment that you're in, whether that's your workplace, whether that's some patterns you picked up across your life, whether that's your family dynamic now, and figure out what parts of that you have control over, which, spoiler alert, is only you, versus what parts outside of you that you need to speak up for. So that's really what I would say is really be gentle and get curious about both internal and external factors.
I like that. I like that a lot. And I agree. I tell my kids all the time, you can only control what you do and how you react. You can't control other people. Jennie, thank you so much for joining us today. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, first off, 2 questions. 1, why would they get in touch with you? What are some of the reasons that they would get in touch with you? And 2, how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah. So at Corporate Rehab, we actually help leaders thrive in the future of work. That's the mission of the company. And so it's coaching, speaking, we have the book. And usually what they get in touch with me is if they want to do one-on-one executive coaching or group coaching, which we're having in January. So good timing. And it's which we're having in January. So good timing. And it's things like diagnosing and recovering from your own burnout, or actually thriving at the next level of your leadership, depending on where you are. Sometimes it's to make a change. Sometimes it's to just get to the next level without losing yourself, and would love to have a conversation if that sounds like you. And the easiest way to do that is to get in touch on the website, which is www.corporate-rehab.com. You can go check out the leadership packages there, or have me as a speaker if that's easier to sometimes have me say this to your boss versus you. Happy to entertain.
You can have the whole, what would Jennie do? Or Jennie said, it's much easier.
Use me exactly as that shield.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Jennie. Everybody have a great day. We will see you next week.
Thanks for having me, Ann.
As we wrap the episode up, we would like to take this time to thank you for joining us this week on Unexpected Journey. Our guest information will be linked in the episode description, along with a link to our company website, remoteevolution.com, and our host website, bibb.com. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share on your favorite podcast app and on our YouTube channel so that you never miss an episode and we can continue to bring them to you. Let us know your thoughts on what we discussed in the comment section. And once again, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again next week for another episode of Unexpected Journey.